Well, hello everyone. My name is Ian Wei. I am now a PhD student at the University of Toronto. I will join Purdue University members next year. So I'm very glad to be here to attend this conference about crowdfunding and present my paper. So this is a joint work, another joint work with me. The title is Market Mechanisms in Online Crowdfunding. A fundamental question in any market is how different market mechanisms affect participant behaviors and transaction outcomes. Auctions and posted price mechanisms are two widely used transaction mechanisms in both online and offline markets. Particularly, auctions have long been a dominant market mechanism in many internet markets. However, in recent years, we noticed a trend that many e-commerce platforms are transforming from auctions to posted prices. Extensive theoretical and empirical work has been done to compare these two mechanisms, including a fairly recent paper investigating debate. In most of these previous papers, they focus on situations where sellers are making endogenous choices between these two mechanisms. Fraudster.com, on the other hand, made a regime change from auctions to a posted price mechanism in late 2010. A unique feature of Fraudster posted price mechanism is that instead of borrowers, Fraudster or the platform sets the interest rates. This regime change provides us a unique research opportunity to study how these two mechanisms affect the borrower and lender behaviors, transaction outcomes, and social welfare. So in this paper, we ask, first of all, how the regime change affected transaction outcomes, including interest rates, funding probability, and default rates. We then ask how the regime change affected participant behavior, especially lender investment behavior. We also investigate whether there was an improvement after the regime change associated with the social welfare. Answers to these questions will shed some light on the underlying factors that drive the trend on e-commerce platforms. So to answer these research questions, we first propose a game theoretic model comparing a type of uniform price auctions with the posted price mechanism. And these two mechanisms are based on the two mechanisms used by Fraudster. Our model generates predictions about transaction outcomes, including the funding probability, the interest rates, and default rates. We then use detailed administrative data from Fraudster to test these model predictions. And we also compare these two mechanisms in terms of total surplus analytically. And we also investigate its effects on lender investment behavior. So specifically, we find that both theoretically and empirically that after the regime change, the interest rates, funding probability, and default rate are all higher under posted prices. And our empirical findings about lender investment behavior lend support to Fraudster's publicly stated reasons for the switch. Specifically, we find that lenders now offer larger amount of funds after the regime change, and the loan's time to be fully funded is much shorter under posted prices. And last but not least, we prove analytically that under some conditions, the old-fashioned auctions outperform posted prices in terms of social welfare. So that's what we found. And this is an outline of my presentation today. Since this is a conference about crowdfunding, I'm skipping the background of this industry. But just to emphasize the background of Fraudster, this is the first database of crowdfunding in the US. It was first opened to the public in February 2006 by last month. 1,000 personal loans with $1 billion have been funded on this single platform. And there are over 2 million borrowers and lenders. And as I mentioned, we in this study, in this research, we studied the regime change that Fraudster made in 2010. So our paper first contributes to the literature on mechanism comparisons by studying a special regime where the platform sets the prices. Unlike most previous papers where they investigate the endogenous choices among sales mechanisms, we study a sudden change in regimes. And more importantly, our results will have implications for the choices of funding mechanisms for the emerging crowdfunding markets. So let me briefly talk about our model. I'm skipping the details, but just to introduce the two mechanisms used by Prosper and the intuitions behind our model. So before the regime change, Prosper was using a type of uniform price options. A typical funding process goes as follows. It starts with the borrower posting a loan request on the website. In the listing, the borrower needs to specify a requested amount of dollars together with a reserve interest rate. And this borrower's reserve interest rate corresponds to his maximum acceptable interest rate. Upon observing this interest rate, any potential lender can submit bids. In each of their bids, the lender needs to choose some amount of dollars with a lender interest rate. So the amount can be in proportion of the loan demand, and the interest rate has to be lower than or equal to the borrower's reserve rate. And after the auction process ends, if the loan is fully funded, the winners will be all lenders who specify the lowest interest rates. And the total amount proposed by these winners will just cover the loan demand. And all other lenders will be excluded from funding the loan and considered as losing lenders. If the loan is fully funded, the contract interest rate will be either the lowest interest rate among the losing lenders, or the reserve interest rate the borrower predetermined before the listing, whichever is low. So this is a standard uniform, multi-unit uniform price option under the context of online personal loan market. And after the regime change, after December 20, 2010, Prosper abandoned this auctions model and switched its whole platform to a new preset interest rate setting. So under the new setting, the funding process still starts with the borrower posting a loan request on the website. And in this case, the borrower only needs to specify the requested amount of dollars. Prosper, or the platform, will preset a fixed interest rate for the personal loan based on the loan characteristics, borrower's credit profile, as well as his borrowing history with Prosper. Then any interested lenders can invest some amount of dollars in the listing again. The amount can be in proportion of the loan demand as well. If the loan is fully funded within a certain period of time, the funding process will end immediately. And the actual lenders will be those who have invested some amount of dollars by that time. Yes?
Do you have those that posted the amount that they wanted and then opted out after Prosper gave them the interest rate that they would charge them?
I don't have that data. I'm not sure how that specifically works because I don't have information before the borrower posted that.
Right, because now you've got this whole selection issue that people selecting into being on this platform, that competition is going to change. So it'd be really interesting to look at who's opting out now because of this new regime change.
That's right. So if we have more data from Prosper, we can probably look at
Let's talk to Ron.
Yeah. So these are the two mechanisms used by Prosper. In this paper, in my model, so we essentially compare these two mechanisms, and our model will generate some predictions about all those transaction outcomes. The intuition behind our model is pretty straightforward. So let's focus on one single personal loan. In the auctions, the interest rate is determined by both borrower and lenders. So when choosing the reserve interest rate, the borrower is facing a trade-off between setting a lower interest rate and maximizing the funding probability. He will favor a lower interest rate because if the interest rate is unnecessarily high, it will be effective over the whole life of the loan. Okay. While under posted prices, the pricing power lies with Prosper. So in my model, we assume that Prosper wants to maximize its profit, which comes from a fractional fee if the loan is funded. In other words, Prosper wants to maximize the loan's probability of being funded. It will only be able to do this by assigning a higher interest rate. So compared to what the borrower would have chosen as the reserve rate, Prosper tends to assign a higher interest rate. So based on this prediction, our hypothesis about other transactional outcomes will immediately follow. So I'm skipping the details of our model and equilibria. And so just as a recap of our predictions about all the transaction outcomes. So the first one is we find that the borrower's reserve rate is strictly lower than Prosper's preset interest rate on the posted license. And governed by this prediction, all the other transaction outcomes like funding probability, the contract interest rate if the loan is funded, as well as the default rate, which is positively correlated with the contract rate, are all higher under posted license. Then we're going to use detailed data from Prosper to test these model predictions. So let's move on to the empirical part. So we obtained data from Prosper, and we're able to download the detailed transactions data at both listing and bid level. So we did this before 2013, and afterwards they hide part of the data. But we also have the borrower's detailed credit profiles, and we also have monthly repayment results for those loans that are successfully funded. And the specific sample we construct include the loans that are posted between August 2010 and April 2011. So just as you recall that the regime change was on December 20th, 2010. So this sample covers 4 months before and 4 months after the regime change, spanning an 8-month period, which is relatively short. So one of the reasons why we choose this sample is that it rules out other major policy changes on Prosper. So within this certain period of time, the only policy change on the website is the regime change that we studied. And more specifically, so in our empirical analysis, we essentially compare transaction outcomes under the 2 regimes. So the outcomes include, as I said, interest rate, funding probability, and default rate. So we argue that after controlling for all the observed characteristics, the sample before and after the regime change are sufficiently similar to conduct the comparative static comparisons. Control variables we include here include borrowers' detailed credit profiles, the loan and listing characteristics, as well as some dummy variables indicating the interest rate categories. So why we include these dummy variables is because Prosper is using a categorical system to assign the interest rates under posted license. So we include this fixed effects to control for unobserved heterogeneity within a certain interest rate category. And more specifically, we use a propensity score matching model. We hypothetically let posted prices be the treatment and auctions be the control, and we estimate a nearest neighbor propensity score matching model to uncover the regime change effect on the transaction outcomes. I'm sort of reluctant to say that this is a causal effect because we can see that this is sort of a very endogenous effect, endogenous regime change on the mechanisms. So we'll see that the estimation results from the data sort of support our theoretical predictions. So this is the result from our main empirical specifications. The first result is about the initial interest rate. So for the initial interest rate, we're comparing the borrower's reserve rate under options and the Prosper's preset interest rate under posted prices. And so we can see that the effect is quite positive. It's quite robust across different specifications. And the estimate suggests about 200 basis points increase in the initial interest rate after the regime change, so which is quite significant in terms of personal loan market. And the second result is about funding probability. This is even more significant positive effect. The estimate is again quite robust across different specifications, and it says the funding probability is more than 20% higher after the posted after the regime change under the posted price mechanism. And the third result is about the comparison of the contract interest rate given the loan is funded. And this estimate is suggesting that more than an increase in more than 100 basis point increase in the contract interest rate. So this is even more significant in terms of personal loan margin. And again, this result is also quite robust across different specifications. And last one is about the default rate. We find some positive effects, although in some specifications the effect is not quite statistically significant. But it also supports our theoretical predictions about default rate. So these are the basic findings from our empirical analysis. All of those are supporting our predictions. And we also did some robustness checks using those simple linear models and logit or probit models, and the results doesn't change. Very significant. And we also investigate the regime change effects on the lender investment behavior. And as I mentioned, we find that lenders now offer larger amount of funds. So if we look at the distributions of bids in terms of the proposing amount, the difference between the two distributions are significant. And we also investigate the loan's time to be fully funded. And we find that after the regime change, more than half of the loan are funded within 80 hours, while this number for loans that are under auctions is more than 140 hours. So this is another significant effect on the lender investment. So these are the basic findings from our empirical analysis. Just as a short summary of this paper, so in this paper we study a change in regimes, and the unique feature of the second regime is that instead of the borrowers, the platform sets the interest rates. And we proposed a model that incorporates three parties: the platform, borrowers, and lenders. And our model generates predictions about transaction outcomes, and we use Prosper data to test these predictions. And basically, the data supports our model predictions. And one possible takeaway from here is that, as I mentioned, this results have both policy and their implications on the choice of funding mechanisms in not only P2P lending market, but also the general crowdfunding environment. So that's it for my presentation. Yes.
So this is fascinating because when you think about the return to the platform versus the return to investors, it's going to be conflicting incentives here. And so what would be really interesting is to look at the return to investors pre and regime, because I mean, Fields and Weiss show that the profit maximizing interest rates, there's credit rationing in equilibrium.
Right.
And so here, I think theoretically what we see is the profits to the investors went down, and the profits to Prosper went up. And so that kind of has really cool implications to designing a platform in which the customers that you're trying to serve are the lenders.
Yeah.
And that lenders who want the better return will then go to that platform because they have the expected return is higher there.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you have those return data for the?
So we were trying to look at that, but the problem is that most of the loans in our study period didn't expired yet.
Yeah.
So, and especially now, I think they're expired, but they're not. Yeah.
They're not like
Are you aware of any competitor to Prosper that would meet this particular initiative, phrase where perhaps they're competing for the lenders by saying that they will perhaps insure against the default or take a lower fee if there's a default? Is it seems like they're acting as a Las Vegas bookie and just setting the odds, but and setting the prices high, and it seems like a vulnerable model.
Yeah, I agree. So as we know, the biggest competitor for Prosper is Lending Club. We don't have data of Lending Club, but we know that Lending Club has a sort of risk control strategy by having a restricted policy on the borrower's credit score. So let's say that the lowest allowable credit score is 640 or something, which was which was much higher than the Prosper's restrictions. That's one aspect. But the other aspect about this is that actually Lending Club is always using the posted price aggregate. I guess part of the reason why Prosper transferred from auctions to posted price is because of the competition from Lending Club. Because they're both competing for not only lenders, but also borrowers.
But the auction model actually allows both to get a better return, the borrowers and the lenders. So they should be able to compete.
Yeah, but the problem with the auctions model is that funding probability is quite low compared to the posted price. Right? So it's borrower and lenders cannot lend their money. So that's one concern. Next question.
Another Mac guy, so how do I get this? I guess it's different from Control
Go off to view.
Sorry?
Go off to view.
Oh, it's
Full screen on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be able to present one of my papers. Let me first just give you some background information about this paper because it has evolved quite a lot. Initially, we had the idea of writing an empirical paper with looking at variations in the securities regulation that is supporting crowd investing, equity crowdfunding. It turns out that there's a number of challenges in collecting this data. So paper evolved more in a regulatory paper where we added a number of discussions on issues that we collected from discussion with the policy regulators in different countries in Europe with lots. So it's going to be more of a discussion on how Europe has evolved in terms of equity crowdfunding and potentially lessons that can be drawn from for the US if Title III of the Jobs Act were initiated. So this is joint work with Lars, who's in Munich. He's from the law school, and I'm from Lille in the finance department. As I just mentioned, as we discussed yesterday, Title III is still being delayed, and this would then bring up the possibility for non-accredited investors to get into the market and also invest along the accredited investors up to an amount of $1 million. The number of concerns, that's why it has been delayed for quite some time. Here I'm citing John Coffey from Columbia, who has this site from the Wall Street Journal. We need to have some experience with equity crowdfunding before we take away the safety net. This is a new and dramatically different procedure with a high potential for fraud. Fraud has been cited for one of the main reasons why this has been delayed. What we are looking at is the European experience. In Europe, equity crowdfunding with the true crowd was possible since the beginning because securities regulation was designed in such a way that it happened to allow public solicitation of the crowd's non-accredited investors since the beginning and under certain conditions. And the idea of this paper is to look at the experience made in Europe and see how platforms have evolved and what could be expected from this. So this is a paper that is more of illustrating a number of things. We don't have any hypothesis to test, there are no hard facts, but we propose a number of tables and graphs that illustrate some of the points that I'm going to make. One of the points, however, we make in the paper, there's a small section that develops a theoretical model where we argue that strong investor protection can hurt entrepreneurial initiatives. There's a large consensus in the empirical finance literature, complete, but there's a consensus that strong investor protection is good for financial development and economic development. Most of this literature, however, takes as measures proxies that pertain to large and publicly listed companies. There are a few papers that just came out that are looking at the Jobs Act, and they show that it may actually be also the other way around for small firms, which would back something that we discuss in a theoretical framework in that paper. So most recently, Dharmapala and Khanna have a paper where they show that the first part of the Jobs Act, which allowed firms to be categorized as an emerging growth company, so EGC, allowed to go into a lighter disclosure, information disclosure procedure, which would entail less cost. They've been looking at whether this had an impact on the stock price of companies. The reason why they can exploit this is because they could reactively decide to be categorized in this format. So they have been looking at firms that went IPO at a time they had a full information disclosure requirement, but due to the reactive procedure of the Jobs Act, suddenly could vote for entering in this lighter procedure, and saw those who opted, whether the stock market reacted positively or not, and they find that there's a positive and significant stock market reaction, suggesting that although they have reduced the amount of information being disclosed, to the fact that this entails lower costs, globally the market reacted positively. Other papers have started also looking at the Jobs Act along these lines. Why this is important for crowdfunding is because crowdfunding indeed uses very different aspects of the securities regulation, in particular exemptions that you have in the regulation that allows them to do that, and the extent to which exemptions are there are likely to affect crowd investing. Our conclusion from this theoretical part is that there's a potentially gain a need for scalable regulation with lighter documentation. So before discussing specific impacts, this is the outline of the regulation in Europe. Again, the main essence of securities regulation is that non-accredited investors, they cannot fend for themselves, while accredited ones, they can fend for themselves, so that they don't need to protect it. But for those who are not accredited, any issuer needs to provide a documentation, prospectus that is validated by the regulator, and that secures that there's some information disclosure and some liability attached to this prospectus in order to increase investor protection and protect the crowd. In Europe, we have a directive, the prospectus directive that harmonizes this at the European level, and that says that any company that issues more than 5 million euros, $6.5 million, needs to have this prospectus approved by the national regulators. However, there are exemptions, and that's where equity crowdfunding could evolve. We call it crowd investing. in Europe. So these are the set of exemptions that we have. One is whether the offer is made to qualified investors. Qualified is essentially the same as the accredited investor in the US. If the offer is made to less than 150 persons, if the nominal value of the security is above 100,000 euro, the minimum participation, so the minimum ticket is more than 100,000 euro, or if the total offer is below 100,000 euro within a 12-month period. The last one is what we call the small offer exemption, and that's where most of the campaigns operate, is to try to be below this total offer exemption, so that no prospectus that is costly and time-consuming to work. A few of the cases, I'll elaborate on this in a few minutes, use a different exemption. We use this one here, where the offer made is less than 250 persons. The important part here is that this doesn't mean that you cannot have 150 investors. It says that you are not allowed to give access to the documentation, investment documentation, to more than 149 people. So this means that if you run a platform, you need to check how many people are actually clicking on the documentation. If 149 people have clicked on it, then it's over. You cannot give access more. The benefit, however, is that then you don't have any limitations in the amount that you can raise. So a couple of the platforms use this specifically. In terms of small offer exemption, I had some discussion yesterday with a few people. Most people then think that there is this 100,000 euro limit, but that's actually just for a few countries. As I mentioned in the directive, it says that the prospectus is needed if the total issue is above 5 million euros, but it doesn't say anything of what happens below. So it only says that if you're below 100,000, there's no prospectus needed, but in the range between 100,000 and 5 million, national regulators have a discretion on what they want to do. So in some countries, they simply said within this range of 100,000 to 5 million, we'll increase this total offer, small offer exemptions up to 5 million or any other number below, where others, they said in this range, prospectus is needed. So for instance, in Austria, it's 100,000, Belgium, France also, Italy used to be also, Germany also, but the Netherlands has 2.5 million, UK 5 million, which means that, for instance, in the Netherlands, if you want to make a general solicitation without a prospectus, you can do so for any offers below 2.5 million euros. Much of the regulatory changes being taking place currently is about increasing this number. So in France, they're increasing it 1 million. Belgium, Italy, Austria is also increasing it. In Germany, it's still 100,000, but we'll see that things are different there. In a separate paper, we have collected data to do some more econometric analysis. Here I'm just showing you one specific table, a summary statistic table about the development of the European market. We have tracked the number of platforms that give access to the non-accredited investors. We have pretty much everything on the continent. In the UK, a few platforms are missing, but these are primarily very small ones that have very little or almost no activities. So it's still a massive industry. There's not that much campaigns that have been successful, although growth is becoming larger. The amounts raised is clearly higher than what you see on average on reward-based crowdfunding, and the number of investors, average number goes up over time. So what I'm going to do next is to look at how, show some illustrations about how securities regulation did affect crowd investing. By the way, in Europe, we tend to talk about crowd investing and not equity crowdfunding, simply because equity is very rare. In most platforms, you do not buy equity company. Only very few platforms do that. Most of them offer different types of securities, and that's why we take a broader concept, which is either as in the UK, the securities-based crowdfunding or crowd investing, which is the same. So a few illustrations on how regulation impacted crowd investing in Europe. The first one is about the size of the crowd investing campaign. This is a picture from SeedMatch, which is a German platform that started in 2011. And as I mentioned, in Germany, the limit was at 100,000 euro. And you can see the first campaigns, they were all at 100,000 euro until at some point, end of 2012, in Germany, they discovered a loophole in the law. They realized that what we mean in Europe as security is not the same definition in Germany, and a very specific type of security is actually excluded in the German translation. And this specific security, which is called Aktiarische Nachrang is some form of note, which is subordinated, or the interest that is paid is not fixed, but linked to a specific profit measure. So it somehow, as many people say, it smells, it talks, and it cracks like equity, but it's not equity. So you're not shareholder. You don't have any say in the company, but your cash flow rights are very similar to equity. So when they discovered this, they essentially shifted towards the securities, and you can see that then the numbers went up. But I don't have a further update, but if I would put the summer period also inside here, we'd see that some of them now raise up to 3 million euros in Germany. And because due to this specific security, they have no constraints on it. The drawback, and that's important for here for securities regulation, is that this securities that is, or the crowd doesn't have any say. It's a note, and but they take pretty much the full risk as equity. Same picture for companies, though, as you can see before and after the quite dramatic change. One thing that is interesting here also to observe, and there's ongoing discussion here about what should be the right number. Let me put it perhaps this one here. There's also a debate in the US whether 1 million is the right number. What we have seen, and there's a table in the paper on that. We have examined the kind of companies you had before and after, and you do see that that there are very different companies inside. What you see later on are companies that require much more money, but they are much more innovative. So the companies we had before tend to be much less capital demanding. That's why they went there, because otherwise they were constrained. But the highly innovative companies did not enter the market as much at the beginning because the 100,000 euro was just too small. So by increasing the threshold, you also change the composition of firms that you're getting in. Investor characteristics. We have been discussing this yesterday. Investor characteristics in terms of what kind of people actually really get into this, and whether it's a democratization of access. Many portals decided just to limit the entry of the crowd by putting high minimum tickets into this. Just to give you an example, Anexago in France, they work with the 150,000 offer exemption, so they just put very high minimum tickets so that on average they have 25 investors, but they raise over 300,000 euro on average. And if you look at it more specifically in terms of this exercise we have been doing in other paper, you have on the x-axis the minimum tickets, and on the y-axis the financial contracting, which extent there are standardized or negotiated. We have collected here for different platforms the degree to which their minimum tickets vary, and whether contracts are just take it or leave it offers. And you see that there's a continuum in the portal's offer between the standard view that the minimum ticket size could be very small, so that you have very few, a lot of crowd that would be able to participate, and the minimum ticket size that can go up, so that the very selective people get inside. If you look at how the impact is, these are statistics we have been able to collect from Investment. So Investment is very different from the previous portals. SeedMatch had a minimum ticket of 250 euros. Companisto had a minimum ticket of 5 euros. So with $6.50 you're in. Investment has a minimum ticket size roughly at 1,000 euro. You can already see that most of the regular crowd does not participate here. If we ask them a number of questions, the job status, for instance, grandmothers, students are clearly not included, are not participating in these portals. Most of the people are self-employed or employees. There are CEOs, executives, consulting, management, IT persons that are quite knowledgeable. Also, in terms of investing experience, the bulk of them have traded directly on their own ordinary stocks or fixed deposits. So these are quite knowledgeable people. And Companisto, we also asked the question at some point about the portfolio diversification, how many they actually invested in. You can see that most of them had, after the portal has already had about 20 offers at that time, a bit more, that most of them do diversify their portfolio quite significantly. Finally, some of the other changes we have seen is that portals themselves change the types of securities and the pooling schemes that they offer. Many of them do offer the pooling schemes, or they pool the crowd together as a way to sort out the corporate governance problems that are ahead of after the investments. Many of them also limit very much the say of the crowd by offering securities like participating notes or convertible bonds. Finally, since time is running out, others, what they do in order to solve some of the screening problems is to do a co-investment scheme. This is the example of my micro-invest. My micro-invest does a mix of a co-investment and pool. So they pool together the crowd in a specific vehicle, which is here my micro-invest finance. But they also let the business angels co-invest, and in particular, business angels do the screening, the due diligence, and they commit a specific amount of money. And once they have made the commitment, the startup goes raise the money on the platform as a way of helping out in solving the due diligence problems that most of these platforms face. The number of things to be said about the regulatory reforms, I leave them for the floor, then if there are specific questions. Just in terms of conclusion, so far, no major fraud cases have been observed, but can't exclude misrepresentation, something that is just too early to say. Someone said yesterday that if you open up to the crowd, then the Wild West will appear. This is what we currently have in Europe, I think. Sort of sorting out has happened, and we saw a lot of experimentation the last 2 years, and I think there's some conclusions that can be drawn out of this. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I'm Nadira Morris. I teach new venture finance here, and my background is also finance, so I do a bit of the equity and the lending stuff. I had 3 papers to discuss.
I'm sorry.
Here's paper number 1, which is actually the same author. It's a very nice paper on, I'm just putting this up. There's a very nice paper on the all or nothing or keep it all model of when you do a deal. And I strongly recommend, I have some problems with the empirics, but I think this is a big question. And the reason I'm putting it up and spending a little bit of my discussion time is that the common theme in these papers in the session is what's the role for intermediation in disintermediated markets, right? How much do you want the pricing of the interest rates in the first paper? Do you want that done by an intermediary? Do you want an intermediary to serve in the last slides or so that the last paper put up that screening role? And I think this is where we're headed, both in the lending side and the equity side. And I think it's what we need to be thinking about in a big picture. This paper also adds to this big picture in terms of thinking about whether you want something a role for the all or nothing or keep the money. Anyway, I recommend that paper, so I'm going to move on. Okay. So on the first paper, this is a very, very nice paper. The experiment is the lending platform moving from an eBay type auction to intermediary prices. Okay. So the idea that processors moving this way goes against the idea that crowdfunding is about it's the market. We don't need an intermediary. Okay, so we need to stop thinking a little bit about that notion. I think if this is where the market's heading, we need to think about not should there be one or not, but what's the role, and to what extent. So all of the academic literature, almost all of it thus far, or things that cross finance on the finance side, talk about asymmetric information and the role of matching and this whole thing. But if we need the intermediary to do the screening, monitoring, punishment, then that whole matching thing is out the window in some sense. Okay. So I personally, my instinct is that I prefer the intermediary one. I think it's a appealing idea that someone's reputation is at stake, and then we're just pooling money and we're pooling ideas and we're allowing for diversification. So I'm a fan of where this route. We have to think about to what extent. So now here, this is what we're gonna. The main point here, and I would have made. I only have 3 slides here. I had 3 papers, so I tried to be thin. But the main point I want to make here is, it's very much about the pricing. Are we paying for the intermediation? Right? That doesn't come out in the model the paper wrote. I think the model's a little bit misspecified in this. The other thing that's not in the model is the idea is volume. Right? The model's very much one loan. Right? Prosper is very much volume. All of them, volume. Right? So what we're thinking here is, what are we willing to pay for this intermediation? And if it cuts the risk, well, maybe we should be paying it, right? I mean, so from an investor point of view or a borrower point of view, what's the optimal intermediation? How much of it do we want? So with that frame, let me go to the paper, which again I think is just super. So the results of the paper is, after the switch to intermediated prices, loans are funded with a higher probability, loans carry higher rates, and loans are more likely to default. Right? This is where we started the discussion after the paper. The point of the pricing mechanism is for the intermediary to screen. That's the point. You've got these buckets, and the intermediary is going to set the rate. Okay? So the authors say that the set of borrowers is better. True, but the set of funded borrowers is worse. So the summary stats that the author didn't put up and the authors choose to interpret one way is that the the borrowers after are not better borrowers. The results suggest to me is this default. If there is a result on default, it has to do with you're creating more volume. And in particular, you're creating more volume with a high-risk set. If you're creating more volume with a high-risk set, that's expanding the market. And to the question of profits, the investor should be compensated. We don't know that answer. I'm very interested in those questions, and I encourage the authors to figure out a way to test that. Super first-order questions the paper is already answering and can even answer more. So I really, really think this is a very important paper, and we should, just not jump on that model because we haven't. I think the paper could say a lot more just going after this idea of what the profit is, and if we've got more volume, then we've got a more complete market on the stimulus device. Okay, so here's the big picture. Again, super paper. I recommend trying the literature more tightly to stimulus device, thinking about the volume as well. Or Jackie Russell, the same thing. And also back to the original Doug Diamond stuff on just what's the role of the intermediary in terms of monitoring, screening, all that literature. There's a lot more to be done. Soft information, right? They have these buckets already. Rossler has these buckets. The way the propensity score match is done is just one. It's a sufficient statistic, but you should be matching doing a propensity score within the bucket. Right? We're not really talking about the soft information that the proprietary model is using. So match within the bucket and then tell us about the profits. I think that's good. We can talk about that after. But I think you can do a little bit better on that. And then finally, here's the thing. Profits. What is who's making profits? Is the borrower, the lender, the investor, the intermediary? And in particular, then, from the finance side, we're very much interested, coming out of the financial crisis, that the slice of financial intermediation is 2% of any kind of investable asset. What's it cost you? Are we able to do better on financial intermediation when we're intermediating disintermediated markets? Whatever that means. Okay? All right, so that's my comments there. All right. Now I'm turning to the next paper. So the paper, it's a lovely presentation. Presentation was in some ways richer and deeper than the one I got out of the paper itself. And I think what I want to do here is, and I would have written this differently, is why the defensiveness here. I would have written this differently after seeing the presentation. But, the thing is thinking broadly. I tend to be too American, but thinking broadly about what these regulations are doing and what we're trying to do with regulations. So the tone of the paper, let me just start with the tone of the paper very much sets up regulations hinder business. Okay, that's fine. Governance and, it can be in conflict with tying the agency issues with the compliance costs, that's fine. And we can think about the regulations on two dimensions. About the regulations on the company side, they need to have audited financials, disclosure, registration, these things, and then regulations on the sophistication and wealth of the investors. Okay, that's fine too. But now what are we trying to do with these dimensions? And to me, the big picture here, and again, this is where the American bias comes in, what is the optimal regulation? Is surely first order question. Right? We surely need to be talking about that. However, the context matters, and we need to set this in kind of what we would say general equilibrium, in the sense that why in the first place do we want this, right? What's not getting funded? I'm not saying there's not things that are not getting funded, but you have to think about what you want to create with crowd investing or equity investing. We're thinking about the Jobs Act. What is it that's not getting funded that we hope to accomplish with the crowd? I'm not saying there's not something there, but we need to know what that is to then think about what the regulation, the extent of that regulation should be. And then the flip side of that is, well, maybe it's not about that at all. It's about who are the investors that are getting the benefit of this asset class exposure. And, are they sufficient, those benefits, to lower the cost of capital such that we'd see more entrepreneurs getting funded? Right? I don't think we can start talking about optimal regulation before we think about how we're dealing with 1 and 2. Now, 3 we talk a lot about. We talk a lot about paternalism and nudging, and the median American has $52,000 in household income, and their wealth is a bit of home equity and $80,000 liquid. Now, that person, should they be doing equity crowd investing? Hard to make that argument, right? So that we talk about. We know this argument, we talk about the Jobs Act. This other stuff, though, we don't, and we should cast any regulation discussion in that big picture of what is it we're trying to accomplish for the investor, and what new entrepreneurs are we trying to be able to fund that we're not funding now, that the angel community is not funding. Now, if you're sitting in Europe, however, the angel community is limited in the first place. There's not much going on, and governments have been pulling out their hair for years and years trying to figure out why can't we get more small business funding. Now, there's exceptions to that. But so in a Europe mentality, there's a labor market stigma to failure that we actually reward failure here, and can we use the crowd to get over some of these other frictions? Okay, why I say all this? The point of saying all this is that once we start putting these things on the map, then what is the regulation going to do? What dimensions of regulation do we care about most in the path that the presentation made some nice, give us some example and put the context in Europe much more tangible. So in terms of the paper, the literature, we totally need to think about the dimensions of possible regulation. There's nothing that does that. That's totally useful. But frankly, I interact with states on a number of household finance issues with the regulators. And how do they make regulation? They call the other states, right? Or someone hands them a matrix of other regulations from other states, and that's how they make regulation. Okay, I'm sure the same is true here. So just putting that out there is first order use for making regulation. I'm less excited about gauging optimal policy in terms of facilitating the crowd, right? Does that mean that that's an accomplished crowd? That doesn't mean that that's not a measurable outcome that we should be concerned about, but have we accomplished something that we can say, oh, that's optimal policy? I'm not sure. I'm more interested in thinking about frankly, I'm interested in who's complaining and who's happy. I'm interested in the protagonist and the antagonist, and to see what people are saying, to give some context for what we're talking about here and struggling with at the Jobs Act level in Washington and also the state levels about thinking about where the policy can go. And then I think finally, this was my slide, the tension in the paper between agency costs and compliance, back to intermediation again. What is the role for intermediation here in terms of setting up a way for punishment? Not thinking about entrepreneurs and equity investments rather than on the debt side we were talking about before. If you're worried about fraud, if these people that are fraudulently taking money from the crowd end up in bankruptcy, is that a sufficient punishment mechanism? And can you set up such kind of punishment mechanisms that would matter to individuals? Can you mitigate ahead of time, and what's the role for the intermediary? Now, on the equity side, fraud, bankruptcy is not on the table, but we need to think about what this intermediary can do. Again, in the screening, monitoring, and punishing, right? This is again the intermediary. And what is this role? Now, if you think there's no role, then that means a different regulation. But I think in order to talk about these things, we need to think about where we're headed in terms of what is it going to look like 5 years from now in terms of equity investing in the crowd. And as it is, the punishment is the lack of access to future rounds. Setting up the milestones. You've got other ways to monitor, combination monitor and punish. Are we going to see that in the crowd? I'm not sure. Where's the value-added services in this? I just don't, I'm not sure where we're going, or I'm not sure we have a complete vision of where we're going. We need to think about what the intermediary is going to serve in that role while we're thinking about policy decisions. Because the policy is going to facilitate that. I didn't say that very clearly, but that's the point. Bringing the papers together, we tend to get excited, by this idea of the match. And I'm not a defender of financial institutions, even though I'm probably, my salary comes out of the fact that there's MBA jobs for them. But I think we need to think about what the role of the financial institutions, again, are these words I keep using over and over again. And I think the interesting questions here are about mitigating risk in this intermediation process and what's the value added in general in terms of operational, also in terms of these risk mitigations and what we're willing to pay for. Okay, that was my discussion.
That was pretty thorough.
Yeah, sorry. That was too much.
So we're gonna invite him back after the E.
Well, technically we're not supposed to. So enjoy your lunch out there, and the data chat will be pretty quick. We'll meet in like half an hour or something.
Let's 12:30, just so there's actual timeline, we'll start the data discussion. So those of you who want to know what access to data we have, come back. Good. Very good.
All right, see you. I'll probably be leaving now. You are going back to that's very nice. Right now, it's just. Was that one?
Yes.
Yes, because,
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. And I think finding that in terms of reliability or quality, that really high. We're having this discussion about whether crowdfunding is model or small stuff and so on. And the person who's talking to said, but surely if the banks aren't lending to these people, there is a reason for that. They're not positions.
The good thing about having crowdfunding we're doing is say you study special experiences, unique access, something new and different. So best friends, they don't know any money. That's the good thing, right? Because they show that they can do something, they can get money, and they can return the reward. So we think in general it does not. There's a lot of reasons why it's less about Facebook like that kind of stuff. What do we do every day? Access this kind of business ourselves, right? So we get the things. It's just a different model. And for years people have done this. You're sitting at the end.
Yeah.
And years ago or something. We don't do the desperation ones, but the whole idea of that people want these businesses to succeed. So we are successful things like this. We're not into it necessarily, but we leave it. Go there a couple times a week, and invite kids to come in there. So when they want to do education, that's good for you. So that's one that works real well because of the interaction with the instructors so often, there's a relationship there that's tight, and then you buy macarons once. So we're seeing a lot of those lessons. So I think that's it also helps them to learn how to do their community. She's got a dance studio and she so, she must be around emotion, she said. So, yeah, it's great.
So are you operating mostly locally?
It's a US based.
And it's fairly widespread?
Yeah, a lot of it is New York, Texas, Texas, and California, Detroit, Detroit, Denver, Scottsdale, Arizona, Tennessee, Colorado, New York. Not that much New England, but
Yes.
the volume is hard to get because
We would be communicating,
Toby. Toby is gonna do things Toby's way. Yeah. Yeah, that's, Toby doesn't.
So who do you work with?
I'm not, I agree with a lot of what Toby's,
Yeah.
but not totally. Because I'm more of a bleeding heart than Toby. Toby has no bleeding heart.
Yes, I'm hard.
Yeah,
What, so why did you come here?
I was in Chicago. So I was super lucky. I have a 4-year-old and yeah. So life is easier here.
Do you know, do you know EJ Reed from Kaufman?
No,
He was part of just moved back to Kansas City to Kaufman from Chicago.
yeah.
And he said it was so illustrative of Kansas City, and they can't live in Kansas City. They have to live out with the bird girl now.
Yeah, because then the legals, then they'll take them away. Yeah.
Literally, it's a
Yeah,
Chicago.
yeah,
They
yeah.
have to live on Kansas City the first time. Like, it was so revealing when also we started being asked about separate checks at the restaurants.
Yeah.
We're not in Chicago anymore, so it's actually it's better than some places.
This is ideal. But that, being a booth though, my goodness, the money, the access, everything is super. Yes.
Yeah.
And the people are fine, just
Yeah.
living in Chicago, but the weather. Where do you live?
Well, I just moved from here to Boulder a couple months ago. And I just told Lee, it just snowed last night, so I'm coming back.
But Boulder's not. Boulder's not bad.
No, it's not.
It's a lovely place.
She's going to be here in Boulder.
I mean, it's I'm split my time.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, going to Estes Park in 3 weeks is like one of the most amazing things with the aspens on fire and the elk wandering around town.
I was just there last week.
Yeah, it's just
But
like,
I go like, come back.
I love aspens.
I do too.
It's my birthday's right around then. I always make for everyone. We're gonna go see aspens for my birthday. That's like.
You got me scared up.
Eastern Sierra.
Yeah, I went to
Good there too. Hope Valley.
yeah, I went to north of Yosemite last.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a fire. But other than that,
How are they turning early this year?
I don't know. I don't really follow until I get close to my birthday. Then I
So
check it
Are
out.
you gonna go to Estes or you gonna go to Tahoe or where?
I don't know. No, because I'm traveling on both sides of the weekend. But so we'll just drive somewhere. But I love. I love it.
No, Boulder is beautiful, and
Yeah.
but like I was selling my house in Marin, and I'm like,
Oh,
I
no.
can't move across the bay. I've got to like move. So I said I'm just gonna go try Boulder, so I didn't want to go back.
Yeah. So you can live anywhere.
Yeah, because I thought. I mean, they would love for me to live in Kansas City, but they give it up after 8 years, and then never been there.
Yeah.
Although they just recently they asked me again. So.
Yeah.
But no, after 6 last night, apparently I've done like, I'm so happy. Huh. I mean, I wonder.
Last year too.
For sure it'll be.
Yeah. And I wanted to say so, I was like gritting. Just so bad that they.
I mean, truly, what's sitting in the audience, just because I briefly kind of read it, skipped it, whatever, and I hadn't really thought about it, and then when he was presenting, I just started, I was truly mortified and after, but actually, honestly, how could you ever do not have a problem with this?
No, good. He's a very nice guy.
It's a very nice.
But that's, and the
So
thing is,
you're gonna be doing another one.
you have one reputation and that one is gone, right? Those guys are, and I know both of them pretty well, they're completely out. Anything they do, look negatively one, I mean, it's just, that's all we have, is reputation.
Yeah.
The fact that it's here. So what else is going on in your place? Yeah.
Well, we're doing a lot of this, this sort of business. Up and running and getting the data from all the accelerators actually kind of build up, capturing the startups that have been very exceptional, like all these ecosystem events, et cetera, sort of look at next, luckily, the coffee thing. A lot of people have come up with weekly or monthly events and all that. Use that
Very nice comment.
Oh, yeah. It's usually not like, great. We were both saying, yeah. They're getting, including on Ron,
Okay, so they.
last night, maybe the whole pop.
Yo soy el
Yeah.
ahorita después de hablar trabajo con él, tengo un proyecto con él.
Kelly Shue, Raj Nair, early prosecutor.
Daba clases en la escuela, pero no lo conozco.
But it's a paper that lives within the office, whether it's or every model that they're using. Right? And then, so you also have to, because otherwise, they provide you.
Gonzalo es un rockstar, bastante, digo, no sé si ubique, no sé tampoco, pero la institución que elige y él le toca toda la parte de las instituciones de país, que depende mucho del dinero que gasta el él me dio clases de desarrollo económico. Yo hago policy analysis, un poco generalizado. Es un proyecto de crowdfunding en México para desarrollar una plataforma de recopilación de información sobre crowdfunding que está ocurriendo en México ahorita y como para tener datos en 3-4 años y poder hacer análisis. Porque ahorita todavía es muy pequeño el entorno. Pero a ver, ¿la política? Las políticas. Ahorita realmente está muy fuera del radar de las autoridades. Como que no hay mucha regulación, porque el equivalente mexicano al SEC todavía no entra en sus competencias de comunicación. Entonces no han tenido manos todavía. La idea ahorita, de hecho, es crear información para ver quién se encarga de eso. Porque digo, es un tema muy... Hay solo 6 plataformas son que han tenido, llevan 3-4 años esperando y han tenido ya. Sí, y como dentro de la fin de la presidencia del trabajo lleva innovación y democratización de la productividad. ¿Dónde aprendiste español? Si tengas un poco el acento de claro, mexicano. Ah, sí. Así es. Con tiempo, los mexicanos han cambiado y más tiempo. Sí. No, pero hablas bastante bien. Ya te encanta todo lo que digo, ¿no?
Taking back,
Es de práctica. ¿En qué estás en la maestría? Okay. Si vas a México, hablas con ellos. A todos les
probably the first thing I have to do. Probably the first thing I should do is
Después ya dejar que les pilles lo mismo.
thank Kaufman, because Kaufman gave us $200,000.
Eso de Guanajuato. Ya,
What was that? Well, so the first thing you do is thank Kaufman, they gave us $200,000, thank Alicia, and to build this database. It's not a lot after Cal takes their cut, but we've got some students, fantastic students, Shao who has taken the lead in actually doing the work. Dave Garrett, who's not here. We have some capstone students as well from our master's program working on this. So we're underway. Looking for your feedback and in the future. So we've got 6 public databases. We have 6 or 7 proprietary databases. I'll talk about later on, which we'll discuss as well. So what we're trying to do here is we've gotten underway in terms of scraping and parsing and cleaning and then building databases. And the intent here, I'm not sure which is going to be a higher priority right now. The intent here is to get almost daily, hopefully daily, ideally daily scraping going forward. We've got complete databases as far back and as far forward. The kind of the big ones. Is there any? I'm new to this space. Are there any other big databases that we should have? That we should go this, that ideally are scrapable.
These are the, excuse me, my name is Korsten, CEO of Simply Corporation. Are these just databases platform, are these platform agnostic databases or just per platform? Because
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
I mean, we have a big data project running under the brand name CrowdFunding, in which we almost have collected 40 to up to 50% of the complete industry, not per platform. So are you referring to a commercial database or just databases per platform? Per platform?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not parsing that. So, okay. Were there any ones that we missed? Or as far as the big ones for now. Okay, so we'll start with those. And these are just stats that we pulled off our databases. They are going to have truncation issues out here, so I would look at there. But crunching, I'm showing you because some nice pictures for it. So this sort of stuff, I'll post these slides. It's stuff you guys have all seen, and we had some talks as well. So I think one of the things we'd like to do for these publicly daily scraped databases is put together some dash panels, some R&D dashboards, and so you can actually see what's going on that daily basis. I suspect that's not going to happen for quite some time, 6 to 9 months or so. So Kickstarter is big in LA, New York, surprisingly less so in Silicon Valley. And again, this is not meant to be
That's your question?
Sure.
So, why, the focus, the rank is by size, but why the focus on, why not a breadth of different crowd
So
activities?
that's what I need. So we don't have many resources. We're trying to fulfill our often grant.
Yeah,
And so tell us the ones that would be useful for you, and we'll try and scrape them and make them available.
yeah, it's not a particular one, it's ideas, right? Getting more diversity in the types of, whether it be a lending product or an equity product and not just a donation or a Kiva, right? It's a little focused.
Yeah, I agree with it, but can you give me specific databases that I can provide that? This is not my research space per se, so
Yeah,
I
no,
can't.
online, right? And,
Okay, so can't say, go ahead.
I would say Angel List as far as equity goes.
Okay,
It's accredited at the moment, but it's the biggest one.
okay, we should mention that as well.
AngelList, yeah, AngelList has a lot of small businesses as opposed to,
Circle Up or,
yeah, exactly.
Okay,
And I'm not against AngelList, it just, that's,
okay.
in addition to a Circle Up or something like that, or even the British ones are great, but maybe we're away from.
So please just give me names, and then I'm gonna ask you all to vote on them, and I'm gonna try and pick them off one by one.
Okay.
To get them up, so, other ones? So, no, thank you.
Yeah, Gus.
That's okay.
So what about the car loan? What's the thing called? So, something, yeah,
That's a student loan.
that's a student one.
oh, yeah. But having diversity across the student one, yeah, that's the student one I was thinking, but also the movement into car loans and different pieces to get. Just,
Okay,
I don't know
We're
where.
interested in education for that.
okay,
Yeah.
I just, you can actually go into your computers and tell me by the end of the chat which ones you want, and we'll rank them as a group, and I will give them a shot, you, and if you've got time to steer through them, we'll start scraping them, so.
You mean let's choose?
Pardon?
You mean let's choose? I mean, you said education was.
Student one.
I just read anything around the student one.
Oh, okay, or, yeah, store or whatever.
I mean, some extent, Lucy, you can drive this as well, because, you know, the space is better, but, again, I come from the innovation and patent stuff, so I don't, it's not my space, I need to be driven by. So Indiegogo, same sort of descriptive stats here. I was surprised when I saw this, actually. It's a lot of good campaign. Fundraiser, and where it's popular outside the US, and older, Rocket Hub, graphic on Rocket Hub users, Lending Club, and Keep It Lend. These also came out of our summertime. We taught a class this summer, and so students went out and scraped these, and then Xiaoyu cleaned up their code. One of the problems relying on students for code is that it's typically not production quality, unfortunately. So, so here is the address where it is. I'm told currently available. We have this up. And you put in your username, password. These are on my blog, by the way. So if you go to my website, there's a blog. You can actually sign up for an email chain. Give you the announcements. All the announcements that we have every day will be sent out on the email chain that we have my blog at any given time. We're just going to try and keep track of who's asking for things. And let us know what you need. I need to be driven by the community's requests and needs. So, and this is just a bit of the schema that we've developed, all the different variables that we've got along all these projects. I'm not going to go through these in huge, again, these slides have been posted. But these databases and schema are not trivial, as those of you who build these things know. So, and we're also struggling with how to make them, how general to make them. Do we have lending and equity in different types of databases? I think that's what we've decided, right? We're going to have different types of databases. So, okay, and the proprietary databases, Richard's got my glasses, I can't see. Richard here?
It's outside.
So,
It is outside.
okay, so Richard has gotten, I think 6 or 7 proprietary databases. The problem we've had with this is part of our contract, is that you ask these people for their data and they'll say, okay. And they sign something where nobody else can use it except Richard or me. I think the way we're going to have to get around that, since this is my primary area of research, is that you guys have to make a proposal. And if I can contribute to that proposal, I'll definitely love to be on it. Or if there's a student I can put you in touch with or a family member. But if I can't, or if I don't have the time to work on it, then I'll just say, great, here's the data. We'll figure out some way so that the data are safe and the platform isn't upset with you. We'll run by the platform. The platform is not upset with you.
Can't they work with any of us that have a Berkeley affiliation now?
I would assume so.
Yeah.
Although they're very careful on these MOUs, and so we're going to have this. This is what that discussion Richard had with you. Yeah, and so contact us if you're curious about proprietary databases, and we'll give you a list. And we want to make this public. It's part of our aim and goal, but I just can't stick my website so everybody can download it. So we're running into more problems with that. We sort of hit those problems last year when we talked about this in our data session, and it's indeed become a problem. So any other databases people have thought about in the meantime? So what other databases would be great? But you guys got to make the choice then. So I'm agnostic on. Any other thoughts or questions?
Wait a second. I have one question about you only have this base. We got a visible web page. We got a visible web page. Project page. Because I have lots.
I don't believe we do. We have a visual web page.
With URLs, so non-traditional.
With URLs. If you can still access it. Is that helpful or?
It's not really available online, right? Because most writing artists, so sometimes difficult, some information can't grab from. It's really not understand what kind of web page it's possible to provide. Because some property web page is very important to design.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to. You're going to have to speak more slowly.
Oh, sorry. Because if we can get web pages,
yeah,
right, some property maybe we can use in the future. Very important.
So can we store web pages?
If we can get.
Download the XML and just store them. It's small enough.
Should I try to do that? Is that going to kill our we need a lot more space to do that? Space intensive sort of.
One thing you might think about doing is somehow trying to record statistics around web traffic on the platform. So like Alexa data or something like that. So you have a sense, I mean, rather than just seeing how much money is coming into the platform, but the potential market.
So people record those data?
So Alexa has an API where you can retrieve that data.
Okay.
Or even just Google search traffic. Those are APIs for that.
Okay. All right.
Lee, are you going to be comparing this against the Nexus about business starts by state?
That'd be nice, but that's a research project. We could talk about trying to do that. But our resources are pretty limited.
So this is all about querying, pulling information in the database for analyzing.
Yeah, and then it's up to our community to do that kind of stuff.
But we actually done a lot in terms of bringing together statistics by MSA, by state, by zip code, et cetera, and that we can tend not to.
Well, do we want to try and slap that up here? I mean, if someone in the community has done that, would be great.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Stay interested crowdfunding states that have them and send it. So it's fairly conserving all of the commissions and getting information from them, information. So. I was thinking of CrowdFunding.
Okay.
And CrowdRise.
I have a question about how these databases are set up. Are they extracted on a regular basis, or is it just a one-time that we took everything?
So as I said, currently they just do it at one time,
Okay.
and our goal is to have daily scrapes.
Because one of the difficulties, so I had a PhD student who extracted out everything from an algorithm from Indiegogo for the paper, and actually Indiegogo and other websites, they delete a number of them on a regular basis, and it's a big bias potentially.
It is, absolutely.
And it would be interesting if these ones are included in the databases.
But at least if we can get an ongoing, it started with getting an ongoing record,
Right.
and we can try to go back and clean everything up, contact these platforms. Okay, thanks very much. We'll stay in touch and use the data and let us know what's needed. We're trying to do this for the community, and we're doing some of the research here, but you guys are going to have to do the bulk of it. We're just too strapped to actually exploit these data. Okay, are you going to, you have 10 minutes to start, Richard?
So family set up the pro, we need to turn it around and get it set up.
Richard? All right, we said that we could get access to these slides. Are they at the website?
Not yet, everything will be, but it's not yet. He's working on it. And these slides I have, but everything else we're working on. Like 6 of those. I'll find one.
Yeah, I thought that's right.
Two more, do it. Bigger. Give it the bang.
That's great.
Okay.
We'll start scraping with it now, so go ahead and fill yourself up.
Are there any further?
6.
I don't think it's the lifetime.
You
No. Para que las ayudas. Acaban de empezar los ¿de qué es tu programa?
No, we're way far away.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah.
Your DJ is outside. We're missing DJ.
That's right.
The DJ is outside. Let me get it.
We're missing two.
Yeah, we're missing two actually.
Okay.
DJ and Christoph.
Christoph, find a random building.
Yes.
I get in the shot.
On his way, though, I suggest you just get started. On his way,
Did you want to introduce the panel
Oh,
and
yes.
the purpose of the panel, or?
Very quickly, first of all, thank you for being diehards and staying through the entire conference. What I'm going to do is take 30 seconds to introduce the logic of this panel, and then at the end I'll make a couple of closing comments, and then we can all network with the conference will be concluding. So we started with global developments and sort of a snapshot of paradigm shifts and things that have occurred, and we've had an opportunity to look at the research literature and to have some very fascinating keynote addresses. So the purpose of this policy is to talk about, from a policy and regulatory and development perspective, what are some of the key issues that need to be addressed. So takeaways from the policy side of the fence, essentially. I've brought in a ringer here, Tracy, and I'll let her introduce herself and why she's the perfect person to lead the panel. So stay tuned. One thing I'd like to invite you all to do very quickly while you're listening to this is, remember the hashtag is Berkeley CF. Maybe tweet out some key papers that need to be written, key research questions that need to be answered, key issues that have emerged, and then I'll collate all those answers and send them out to everybody. So maybe just do a brain dump as you're listening to this and things that have been percolating. So I can invite you to share that through Twitter now, and then we'll send it out to everybody. So again, the hashtag is Berkeley CF. Thank you all.
Thank you, Richard, for organizing this. I think this is a really interesting group. I'm Tracy Mock. I'm the senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board. So if you want to talk regulation, we do a lot of regulation, although we do mostly bank regulation. So this is sort of a brand new world for us, but the Fed is very interested in referring on the space. Insofar as we're very interested in small business and business access to credit and where they're going to get their funding to keep going and generating employment and such in the economy. So this is a really important topic for us, and I'm very interested in hearing the panel's answers to some of the questions I have for them. We have a big panel, excuse me, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about backgrounds. They're very well qualified, doing a lot of really interesting research. As it comes into the questions that you're asked, feel free to talk a little bit about how your background in particular interests and things
lead into the things, but I will introduce folks to my immediate left. We have, you're not here. You're not on my list.
I'm not on the list, no, I was a last minute addition. I'm Portia Zonfi, CEO of Civic Corporation, one of the leading crowdfunding platforms in Europe, working on their banking license. So to that extent, we know a little bit about the regulatory frameworks, and I would very much like to give the European perspective on this discussion. You should put it up.
Do it out, yes. And then we have Thompson Quick, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
from Singapore. Next to her is Christopher Rao from Offerboard. We have Marisol McGee, one of my colleagues. I am in research and statistics, and Marisol is in the development side of things. Then we have Devin Thorpe, who is from the Champion of Social Good and Markham Rural Foundation. Next to him is Christophe, who is a visiting research fellow here at Berkeley, working on his PhD. And then finally, rounding us all off, we have DJ Paul with Propeller. All right. So in the last day and a half, however long it's been that we've been here, there have been some common themes that have come out of the conference. And I'm just going to summarize here before I start asking questions. But education, inclusion, democratization, transparency, the need for data that we can actually believe, and the need for more research. Okay, so the questions I have broadly fit into those categories. So in my mind, as I listen to this, the democratization really is really a twofold type question. It's democratization in getting the money to different types of firms, putting it in geographically and demographically different areas where it's not traditionally flowed, as well as getting people involved in the system who have not typically been able to participate in the small business, in the business funding side of things. So how do we get there? What do you think that, I'm going to start out with probably one for Marisol, because I know the sort of research and things you do, but how can we construct policy that gets crowdfunding into the typically underserved neighborhoods, the low to middle income neighborhoods? We know that the cost of compliance is predicted to be very big. It doesn't seem like this is something that most firms in the low-income areas can effectively do. What sort of policy or suggestions do you have around that?
I'm not sure what kind of policy we should develop around this. It's, there's a need to protect the investors, and there's a need to kind of support small businesses. And the reporting requirements on the equity side seem to be very, very prohibitive. I mean, we're going to have companies that could probably walk to a venture capital firm, to banks, to a lot of other institutions that offer capital, versus anyone in the low and moderate income community. Your local dry cleaner, your restaurateur that wants to expand. Those are the sorts of folks that I deal with all the time. The Division of Consumer and Community Affairs, the board is specifically tasked with having voices of consumers and communities at the board, right? And a lot of the folks that we're speaking to, the advocates for LMI folks, kind of note that this is not exactly the space that we're going to be working in. We've tried to put a lot of research on the donation-based crowdfunding, to try to kind of figure out how maybe a lot of nonprofits can raise money, and we've had some inroads in that, but as far as the small business goes, it seems like it's going to be a lot harder. There's more opportunities for small businesses, especially small businesses in LMI communities, to take on some debt and to crowdfund on the debt side. They do have the opportunity there. They have 2 years worth of operating expenses and bank records that they can submit and get loans on the equity side. This does not seem like it's going to be targeting the communities that we're interested in.
Evan, given your interest in social work for good, what thoughts do you have on this?
Well, a lot.
A lot.
First, I think that the regulatory framework we have been operating under for the last few years has been a contributing factor, perhaps not a big one, but a contributing factor nonetheless in the disparity of income in the United States, especially growing over the last 50 years, because ordinary investors have been precluded from investing in the highest return investment opportunities. So they have been protected from this asset class. That needs to stop. So that's thing one. Thing two, based on my experience in crowdfunding for nonprofits, the low and moderate income people are very generous with their, it's very modest. I think they will invest in opportunities when they're given those opportunities, but the investment thresholds will need to be remarkably low. There was a reference in the last hour to the investments being as low as €5. That's the scale at which we need to be talking about for LMI families in order to participate in equity or even debt crowdfunding in a meaningful way. And I think there will be platforms that will set that up. Not certainly everybody. Chris's platform probably won't go there, but there will be platforms that do. And so we need to then figure out a regulatory structure that doesn't burden those small enterprises that are taking money from LMI families with extra reporting requirements, because those businesses almost certainly will be, by and large, Main Street neighborhood businesses. They're not going to be as often the businesses that will be growing by leaps and bounds, and it will end up on Chris's platform raising money.
So what regulations specifically need to change? Are you talking about Title III that has not
Yeah.
happened, or?
Yeah, I think the big things with Title III are adjusting the audit requirements so that those are removed. And I want to be really clear, no one talks about the review requirement. And it's because that review sounds so innocuous. A review is a very specific procedure that looks an awful lot like and costs an awful lot like an audit. So if you raise more than $100,000, you have to have a review under the statute. That needs to change. There probably shouldn't be any requirement for people raising less than $1 million to have an audit done. A venture capitalist wouldn't require it, so an LMI family shouldn't require it either. They should have the same judgment that a smart, sophisticated, experienced investor would have, and that sophisticated investor is saying an audit doesn't serve me nearly as much as it costs, so I don't want one. So that should probably go. I think also the annual reporting requirements should be clarified to be clear that it's non-public. And some of the language of the law and the rules seem to anticipate that shares of crowdfunding companies will trade. And although I really like that, I think it's not very practical, especially for your Main Street kinds of businesses that may end up with 130 shareholders. Anticipating that those shares will trade is probably folly. It would be better to instead figure out mechanisms to establish the permanence of their private nature, and the only redemption would be through sale of the company or dividends. Anyway, those are some quick thoughts.
And on the European side, is this something that has come up in the European context? I have to plead ignorance here. I don't know a whole lot about the European side in terms of, are there concerns about giving funding to some of the smaller, more mainstream businesses?
I think the regulatory framework in Europe, for that matter, already allows for funding to smaller businesses, not the hockey stick growth companies, but more mom-and-pop businesses. For example, we did small cheese factory for €50,000. I think the important part to note here is that it's we need to take a closer look to how you structure those kind of deals, how you inform investors. And by basically building the bridge by walking, we came up with some interesting mechanisms. For example, in bundling all the investors into an SPV. Many people yesterday saw the crowd presentation. That's basically also the model we employ. However, we let the SPV be self-organized. So the actual board of the SPV is being formed by the entrepreneur and the shareholders itself. And the SPV itself also allows for a trading facility. First of all, within the closed group of investors, but if you can't find a buyer, so basically the entrepreneur is not willing to buy back the shares, or the other investors are not willing to put on the table the price that's being asked, you are allowed to solicit outside of the SPV itself, making it a pretty vibrant system for small businesses, and also in terms of how these businesses grow. This is much being influenced by the actual investors. So taking back, for example, the cheese factory example, what we saw was an entrepreneur raising 50,000 euros to expand this production capacity of cheese, and now all of a sudden, due to this crowdfunding campaign, he's more connected with most of his suppliers, restaurateurs. Those were actually his clients already, but now they invested into the company. So the value chain itself is integrated, and with the actual tooling that we offer within our platform, the entrepreneur is guided towards new categories, new product categories. So for example, now he's also selling off biological milk, which is also directly into the value chain itself. And I think that is also spurring, I would say, entrepreneurs from regions that are deprived of capital or in any events have lesser access to financial sources to be funded by the crowd, but also to be steered in any event by the crowd. And these SPVs, vehicles that we set up, even allow for legally binding shareholder voting processes. In terms of failure ratios, when I look at an average SME company, I think we all know this, especially the entrepreneurs here in the venue. It's a bit of a long move kind of mentality. You start out early in the morning selling, and at 9 you're still doing your accounting practices. So it can be kind of hard to be enthusiastic about your business on a day-to-day basis. And with the crowd being involved, I think that changes to a great extent. And the perceived idea of ownership between somebody putting in 10,000 euros or 20 euros is roughly the same. And most of our investors even say 97% that have actively invested into these companies say, we don't mind, we pay for the trip. The destination, whether this is a multi-billion-dollar company or a failure, so be it. I mean, we're talking about $100, $200 in bucket investment. And the regulatory frameworks in Europe allow for such mechanisms.
So, do you want to speak from the side of the crowd in terms of, we have this whole accredited, non-accredited investor in the US, is there something similar?
There's something similar, but the problem is when people talk about regulation, and in Europe as well, the focus is often on promotion and solicitation regimes. And as Christian says, yeah, on that level, there are opportunities, there are possibilities. It's not completely forbidden to publicly solicit investments from public. My biggest concern in terms of regulation, and specifically for Europe, are two other things, namely one of the company laws and the platform operators. So those activities, the regulations, they are often overlooked. For instance, a small company.
Okay, I'm going to try to cut this off. I have regulations, you don't have this.
Oh, okay.
So I think to come back to regulation.
Yeah.
But is there, from the investor side, are there things that prohibit, say, the low to moderate income investors? Are there regulations that don't allow them, or that make it more difficult or more expensive, cost prohibitive for them to invest?
Yeah, but it's country specific. Which is a kind of burden, specifically because crowdfunding is an internet activity. So it limits the markets largely to national boundaries. So there are countries that are very black-followed, very liberal. And there are countries that are very restrictive. And then indeed you need to have that requires some qualification on the level of the investor. It largely depends on the history of the country, because in Europe, let's face it, the government has some kind of welfare idea in mind, so that implies in the European mindset that it implies to protect the ordinary people from risks. Might be their houses, sometimes might be the health, but it's also investments, for instance. Which is too bad if you talk about small amounts of money, in a sense. It's not always the investment, but it's just being part of something. country specific, but many countries it's yeah, very
I wanted to just quickly, because I don't think anybody really has an answer for this because I don't have the data for it. But what do you think that the implications are for crowdfunding and wealth redistribution? The survey of consumer finances for the U.S. just came out and said that it impacts the wealthier. The top 3% of wealth distribution now officially hold 55% of all wealth in the U.S., right? And that is up from 44% in '89 and 51% in 2007. So they just keep getting wealthier and wealthier. Do we think that crowdfunding is a mechanism by where we're going to redistribute wealth, either in the U.S. or across the world? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's not about redistributing wealth, but to give the startups, the entrepreneurs a chance to get funding easier for if they believe in what they're creating. So, you know, the wealthier will definitely continue to be wealthier unless they do something different that, you know, that have them go not so wealthier, but it gives a whole branding perspective of possibilities with the startups or to the mom and pops, you know, or to the minority. I mean, in specific for Asia, we're talking about a lot of emerging countries where crowdfunding become, you know, really a ray of hope, specifically to Indonesia, the creative economies, to Thailand, to the ASEAN countries, where funding has always been a challenge for, let's say, the rural area, for the community aspect, the social aspect. And again, equity lending is totally new space. There are a lot of work to be done in those places. So, you know, that is something where we still too early to tell whether it's like going to make a significant difference. But this whole space on crowdfunding definitely, you know, gives a whole lot of perspective, a whole lot of possibilities. And who knows, you know, somebody would just, like the Oculus case, right? They get supported and then they get bought over by somebody. Yeah, I mean, that particular inventors or innovators could become rich. Yeah, so that is what I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean,
you want to say something?
No, just the way that we frame it, you know, it's not, I don't know if it's appropriate to discuss it in terms of redistribution of wealth so much as talk about the democratization of access to capital. So it's the democratization of the access to wealth creation. And maybe that's a better way to frame it, maybe not, whatever. It also politically perhaps is a little less, can be a little less off-putting. It's unclear, however, whether that will do that. But if we don't try it, it's not going to be better. So whether this moves the needle significantly or not, I don't know. The data's not out there. We haven't, you know, Title III is not lit up yet. I think we're already going to start seeing that there's, at least in the United States, Title II is starting to be embraced by a broader swath, perhaps, of people. Now that's not, you know, low and middle income. That's basically wealthy people, rich people becoming wealthy, or, you know, going to another level. But still, it's reaching down a bit. And it's not nothing, but we have to push on several levels in order to address the problem of wealth distribution. This is merely one of them. It could be a significant one. So there's that.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think one thing that hasn't been brought up that clearly is one of the great potentials of crowdfunding to actually help remedy poverty around the world is connecting local populations to the diaspora populations in the developed world. And I don't think anyone's really figured that out well. Kiva creates kind of a model that's a little different. By sort of underwriting the poor, in essence, they give people in the developed world a sense that, oh, I can give or lend to this person and everything's going to be okay. I'm trusting Kiva to do their homework. Really, to scale crowdfunding, though, we'll need to have people connecting at a far faster scale than Kiva can manage, or that really anyone can manage. And so we'll need, I think, to find ways for those diaspora communities to do the underwriting and vetting and culling and curating
And that is a great segue into sort of the next group of questions that I wanted to talk about. So what are, from what I've heard in the last day and a half, the two significant barriers to growth and scaling are education, educating both borrowers, lenders, and regulators. I would argue need to be educated, and regulations. Okay. So I think how and when to best educate the three different groups of participants. If anybody had any specific thoughts on them, I would welcome that, but I think sort of what this group is probably better at answering are what are the largest barriers to growth and scaling that you see at this point? Chris, did you want to jump in here? We had a person do that.
Hello. My experience with the education of regulators as the chairman of CIFRA, which is an association for crowdfunding tools, platforms, and industry players, with respect to their dialogue with regulators, has been that the regulators, particularly with respect to U.S. crowdfunding rules, have been incredibly curious, very willing to dialogue, and very interested in how the industry will actually operate in the context of the rules so that they can develop rules that actually work. That being said, to add to the list of things that Devin mentioned that are necessary from a regulatory standpoint in the United States, one of the ones that hasn't yet gotten through is that right now, Title III imputes issuer liability to portals, which I think could be disastrous for market development portals in that particular risk environment. In terms of when to educate, it's constant. It's constant and persistent. And one of the missing things that I think this conference has identified is the lack of data to support fact claims, either by portals or by people trying to make industry claims. It just doesn't exist. After he left the SEC, its most recent chief economist, I called David, and he said, when we were at the SEC, when I was chief economist at the SEC, we went looking for the data, and it doesn't exist. We could not find anyone who had gathered and made available significant amounts of data that could answer the question, does providing capital to small businesses through crowdfunding or some crowdfunding-like enterprise create jobs or not on a macro scale? And you can find individual platforms. The longest operating platform, which I serve on the board of in Australia, can identify, yes, the survival rate of our companies is higher than average. Yes, they've created an average of X jobs per dollar invested. But that's just one platform. And to really get a sense of how this works, I think we need to go not only across platforms, but across countries, and get the data we need to understand the policy decisions that people make.
I would say, though, do I need this? Is everybody not? My voice tends to carry. You're good. Thanks, Richard. I think that there's a cultural component here. Okay, I don't think the data, from Australia, although I've quoted it many times before, to the SEC, is necessarily applicable to a market like the United States up to a point. There's some basic cultural issues that simply don't transfer. I mean, I was working in Mexico briefly to try to get something going. There's not going to be equity in Mexico because culturally, or not for a while. And forget about the legality of it, and whether it's, let's say we would fiat that, just make it legal and everything's fine. Culturally, they're more comfortable in debt. The idea of giving a part of your company is simply, doesn't compute. It's anathema to them. So sometimes these things, there are definitely cultural components that I'm not sophisticated enough to identify, but I'm sophisticated enough to say it definitely exists because I bumped into them. I will say that the data issue is not just, it's incredibly difficult on, say, Title III, proper crowdfunding, because it doesn't exist any data about something different. And even if we were to come up with analogies to other countries to try to bring them here, the opponents of crowdfunding will simply make the distinction that I just made. Well, that's fine for Holland, it's fine for us, so that none of the 5 American apply. So that's one thing. What's more upsetting and striking is perhaps a robust market like 506, which is what Title II references, robust enough to claim to have raised over, over $1 trillion in each year of the last 3 years. And I think it's on average like 900 billion. That the data for that is actually pretty paltry, other than a report from the SEC put out last July, I think it was actually pretty good. There's still an awful lot of things that we would like to know, that we need to know. And this is on both sides, both the opponents of say, the democratization of, however, and those of us who are more in favor of it. So, recently, CIFRA, which I'm the co-chair, I sit underneath Chris on that. We sent a letter.
Clearly decided above, but okay.
That request that had to do with the definition of accredited investor, which is something we touched on, but it's not, may not be a global issue. But in that, we said, and by the way, don't do anything, please, until you go get the data, which everybody wants, and they have the ability to get. We really do need that, and lacking that, it's awfully hard to make broad statements. I mean, there's intuitive things, but
So is it, or would you say that it should be in charge of the SEC should be collecting the data? Who should collect the data?
In the United States?
How often? In the US?
Certainly the SEC is going to do it. I think, OMB and which other organizations would do that. I mean, it certainly has to be something that I would think it's going to be it's going to be more trustworthy if it's done by a government agency up to a point. Although there's certainly, I don't know if everybody's heard about this, there's certain aspects of American culture that don't trust anything that comes out of the government. But anything, not that it's not completely irrational, but there's also, I don't know who else would take that on. I've seen some statistics from the SBA, which are helpful, but in pieces. But I certainly think it's far too large a job, at least in the United States, with an economy as big as this, for it to be done completely at the private level. Coffee can kick in something, we can get something out of nothing. Really, at some point, needs to be collated, I think, at the federal level. But
well, there are also certain aspects of this data that are quite valuable. In the U.S., in the public markets, that data is aggregated by all the people that create it, and they rent it, and they all make money on having it. So one of the real difficulties in collecting and distributing data on financing platforms is that many of them aren't giving over their data because it's one of the most valuable things they have in creating. It's part of their competitive advantage. So I think there is a role for private industry in starting to aggregate and distribute data, maybe even on an economic basis, but at least making it available for a fee so that that data can be used and can create additional value. But I mean, we could start with Form D. We already have transactional reporting in 506. Start with Form D and make it better. Right now, the amendments to Form D actually make it harder to comply with. We're already, when we try to do analysis of the Form D data that's already being published, the way in which they classify businesses is less relevant than actually trying to figure out where the business activity is going on. And there are some very basic questions that aren't being asked on Form D that would be checkboxes that would be relatively easy to collect. So we could start there and say, look, the federal government is already taking an obligation to collect transactional data. Let's do that better, and let's make that as valuable a source as we can have. They already have the facility at Edgar, so they don't even need a new facility for collection and reporting. It already exists, and for most data that gets submitted, it's already mandatorily electronic, which is also another problem with data collection, is that not all the sources, and this is becoming less true, but not all the sources are aggregating it easily and electronically, and therefore
So in terms of regulatory burdens, barriers moving on from the education, data collection, okay, so we've identified this. What other regulatory barriers are there to scaling, to making crowdfunding viable on a larger scale? And this I'm going to go back to, because I promised you I would. We want to talk about in Europe, what are the biggest regulatory barriers that you see?
Well, besides the promotion and solicitation that I told you a moment ago, I think one of the biggest things is on the level of the companies that want to use it, but they are limited to actually crowdfund. And then secondly, on the people that want to operate the platform, that want to operate the infrastructure, basically. On the level of companies, let's face it, companies that use crowdfunding are usually small companies, often unscalable or even very small, as everybody agrees. The problem is, if I take the situation of Europe, among the menu of different company types that are there, if you're a small company, you choose the cheapest one. The cheapest company types, however, are designed for closely held entities, for family businesses that don't really want to offer their units to third parties. But the problem is if you exactly choose that cheapest type of company, if you choose that one and you want to sell a unit to the public, you can't. Not because the promotion and solicitation regimes limit you because they offer opportunities, but because the company law doesn't offer you that opportunity. So that brings the companies to the point that they need to use a platform, because the platform engineers some kind of transaction model around that obstacle. But platform operators, they have, specifically for Europe, we have one regulation that it regulates the professional activity within the markets and financial instruments activity. That is the same for all of Europe. The only problem is the interpretation is on national level. So there comes the history and of what a country used to apply before, even before that unified regulation came into place. There, when you really have a mindset, because the regulators still have a mindset of So in one country, you might come up with a business model for a platform that says, well, you will structure it like that. Investors will have access to that information. Why do you find for one country? But if you want to scale to another country, that's a problem. Because another country, because France, for instance, might consider, yeah, but for us it touches too many regulated areas, you can't do that. While you might do it in Germany, perhaps. So that's so scalable. As a platform, you can't, or you need to have different entities per country, and you need to really fit within the interpretation of one country. But one platform that operates on a Europe-wide level is practically impossible.
I walked this path, which is very frustrating. To any event, the European Union in terms of offering regimes is not a union. So there we have it. When we first ran into this particular problem, we were basically forced to get a banking license, which is obviously a heavy burden upon your burn rate as a startup company. I mean, all of a sudden you need to comply to certain regulatory demands. UBO, ultimate beneficiary owner identification, anti-terrorism financing, those kind of things. But this allows us now to solicit throughout the complete Eurozone. However, the origination is always taking place under Dutch law. So there are two different sides to the model here. And when you really want to provide a pan-European crowdfunding platform for both origination of deals as well as investors, you're getting into the very high range of licenses. You'll probably go towards basically a stock market license, which is obviously even more expensive than a banking license as such. However, there are opportunities, and what you see now is the platforms that are performing well are actually willing to take that responsibility, because we basically have a track record, and also the questions regarding the data itself. I mean, we have data on how these companies performed over a couple of years. We see a couple of winners in the European market now coming up, and now we get an interesting question from our investors saying, "Hey, I love the idea when you came onto the market in 2011. Now it's 2014. How are the companies performing?" So you see that the investors themselves are also becoming more educated, and they become more demanding of the platform. Obviously, professionalizing the infrastructure over time, but I heard a couple of times, you need to start somewhere with data collection, with basically building the bridge by walking. And we will make mistakes, but hopefully the end result is better than what it is right now.
Are there examples where the cross-border cooperation, where there are regulations that facilitate it?
I think so. I think one of the most important and overlooked things is that the European Union, and especially as many companies, are pretty much addicted to debt financing. So around 90% of the small and medium-sized enterprises used to be funded with debt. So when we first started out, the first question we got from entrepreneurs was, "What's the interest rate?" This is equity funding. So you start evangelizing to a very great extent, and then we got the Basel III treaty, which is basically putting up some demands for solvency ratios to the banks itself. So all of a sudden, basically, the floodgate of debt was surely but surely closed. And now we see a lot of interest in equity funding, basically to brush up the solvency and get back to the banking system again. So it's about cooperation between the different forms of financing and mixing up various forms of alternative financing, preferably in one system. But again, this is experimenting a lot.
There's just one thing I would like to add. Indeed, it's true that if you want to put a lot of money on the table, that you can apply for licensed activities that basically operate under Europe-wide regulations. The only problem is, even there you face the national limitation, because you mentioned stock exchange license, for instance, but it's good a regulated market, and that's the name of a license that you need for a stock exchange in Europe. The regulation simply forgot the passport English for that, for instance. Yeah, so basically, you still have other type of licenses, for instance, trading platforms, for instance. So we find the trading platforms and use license in multilateral trading facility. Some platforms are looking into that type of license.
That's only for secondary trades, correct?
No, you can do it for primary trading as well, but the only problem is basically that license does not allow you to directly let end users connect to the platform. They need to go to an intermediary first. Right? Yeah, so that's written like that. And some countries will say, okay, fine. But other countries will use the interpretation. So even if you go for the most expensive one, if you have your banking license or whatever, you still face the national interpretation.
Well, if it makes the European fellows feel any better, the analogies to the problems in the United States are almost perfect. We have different terms, but we have the same problems. Instead of having country by country, of course, we have state by state. That's why interstate crowdfunding in the United States is probably never really going to do much other than maybe be a wonderful proof of concept in the states that have adopted it. But ultimately, we need to use the federal licenses. And what was supposed to be, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, because I know that I understand the distinctions among some of the licenses you're talking about, but portals for Title III are a new designation of a financial service company. We'll see whether or not that ends up being anything. Honestly, it looks like most of the more significant platforms will become broker-dealers, which I believe would be more or less the equivalent of some sort of blend between the bank and the stockbroker for the brokerage license. And we're wading through it. So, you know,
but just to look at the cost structure of a broker-dealer, right? I mean, you're talking about something that has to be, that is regulated by 54 regulators in the United States, and has to pay fees on an annual basis to all of those regulators in order to stay regulated and in compliance, and then have its transactions comply with 54 different regulators.
And it's easy to have really here's the problem. Okay, so to answer your question, just to bring it back, you say, well, what can we do to facilitate this happening, to lower the barriers, to lessen the regulations? The other problem is this: if we would like this to actually be a source for the democratization of wealth creation, we're going to have to do something to protect investors. There are unscrupulous people on the planet. I know that that's terrifying to contemplate here in Berkeley. That does in fact happen. And we have to do something. There have to be some, you know, I don't think the other side of this argument, oftentimes I'm on the side of, you know, less is more. But people need to be protected. There's a reason these rules that were put together in the United States in the 30s didn't come out of nowhere, right? They came out of a need because people were being taken advantage of. Now, perhaps they're 80 years archaic and there are changes, but the notion of simply being a Wild West is not, it's not comforting to me. People are going to have to, there's going to have to be something. The question is, can we get away with less? Will less be sufficient? Will less be ample and adequate? And I think the answer is probably yes. Striking that balance is awfully good.
Yes, yes. And it's not only frightening to you. It's frightening.
I'm sure it's frightening. I'm not very special.
You're not very special. I'm sorry.
Are we getting the questions?
I was going to take questions for the end, but if you wanted to go ahead, if you have something particularly relevant, feel free.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. I wanted to ask a question about the broker-dealers. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no.
The question was, and whether you want to, as we roll out, are we going to see JP Morgan? Are we going to see E-Trade? Are we going to see a gazillion independents? What are we going to see? Right? I mean, I have thoughts on it, and I have no idea what you're going to
Yeah, they're going to move them as soon as it becomes lucrative for them to do so.
Okay, but that's anyway. JP Morgan.
Yeah, the E-Trade guys, the guys that internationalized E-Trade now run CrowdFunding. The guys from KIR who joined E-Trade when it messed up its internationalization and had to fix it. And fix it. I'm starting to say that gently. The guys that went in and fixed it, they've now built a transactional platform. They own a broker dealer, and they're moving forward. So I think you could say in some ways E-Trade's already in it. Or at least some of the people from E-Trade are already in it. And I think that JP Morgan is going to get into it. And DJ's right, when it becomes lucrative for them to do so. I think right now they have the innovator's dilemma. I think they're letting those of us who are building platforms and trying to figure this out, error by error and learning by learning, go through the early innovation process, and when it gets mature in some sense, they're going to go buy. They're going to go buy some platforms. They're gonna invest in the infrastructure and the changes they need to make in order for it to be compatible with them. NASDAQ already took the first step in its acquisition of part of SharesPost and its creation of NASDAQ Private Markets, which intends to continue this blurring of the public and private markets and bring to the private markets a lot of public market infrastructure to prepare companies to upstream to NASDAQ and move to counter markets. So I think the answer is not only yes they will, but yes they are.
I think there's something else that's probably going to happen, and I would be curious to see whether or not there's an analogy to Europe, because I don't know if that's all you guys. I think that what happens is this. Let's imagine Title III comes out. Let's imagine that there are multiple platforms and there's a proliferation of them. And let's say that it's actually successful. It's a new asset class. It's a brand new thing. It's not stock. It's not a private placement. Some sort of blend of the two, whatever. And it does well. If you're a retail broker, Schwab, E-Trade, whatever, you look at that and go, okay, I don't know what that is yet, but those guys made something that individual investors bought stock in or bonds in. You now have a list of hundreds, perhaps hundreds of thousands of new customers who never bought a share of publicly traded stock before, but bought a share of or a security called a crowdfunding security. You would buy that even if it were a lost leader. You'd buy that platform with that list of actual people who actually transacted, and then upsell them, public securities, and the rest of your financial services products that you offer as a broker dealer, as a bank. I think that's where it goes, which would be a wonderful problem to have 10 or 12 years from now, or however long it goes. But I do think that's what happens. I think that they get acquired by the broker dealers, the larger names like JP Morgan that you mentioned before. We'll see. I don't know what that's like, if that's something you guys have contemplated in Europe or in Asia.
Yeah, we work on a local level within the JV structure with local financial banks, stock markets, and stock markets in Europe are pretty much deprived of, the unsophisticated investors that give the portfolios up to 50,000 euros. And they were all, and this goes country by country, but they approach us like, hey guys, how did you come up with it? In 3 years, you have 25,000 investors. You did this. For Dutch, in the Dutch market, we have 10% market share in equity investments into equities, which is pretty small. Yeah. If we start talking about the sheer size of the Netherlands, it's probably not that impressive. But in terms of the investor profiles and getting more traction onto the markets, for example, small caps and mid caps, on some days we do more volume than an average mid cap stock. So yeah, that gives you an idea of what is going on.
Impressive.
So are there different barriers for moving or scaling up or growing or entering into some of the emerging economies?
I think for Asia, we are really at an infancy stage where regulations and, or rather, we require a lot of education to the regulators, to the industry, to the whole entire space. So whatever that is well practiced in America, in Europe, this is what Asia is looking at and studying at the same time and training very carefully. Jason has a big part to play in some of the countries like Malaysia, and recently he visited Singapore because of the summit that I organized, and he has also met up with some people. So the countries in Asia are getting to know more. But of course, in the space of like Singapore, they have softly put equity crowdfunding is available on the website. but they're not promoting loudly to the industry and say, okay, enrolling people to actually start equity platform, because it does require license, it require to follow some regulations. So in the space of Malaysia, Jason's going to speak a bit next week over there. They call for papers on equity crowdfunding. But while they call for papers, they have also provided the answers to educate the market. Thailand, Indonesia, they're all learning. They're all catching up and not wanting to lose the space of not getting into the equity space. While for lending, that phase is, the rest of the countries are rather conservative, but Willis, who is here, mentioned that Central Bank in Singapore has given you a green light, right? Yeah, so, which means to say that that phase crowdfunding would be in action in Singapore. But again, for the whole entire Asia, different countries, it's just like in America, you have different states. In Europe, you have different states, different countries as well. So in Asia, we just have a much bigger challenge because culturally, countries are different. The language is different, currency is different. While having said, ASEAN, that made up of 10 countries, are coming together next year with the 2015 ASEAN Open. That would set up probably another area of concern. So the education will continue. A lot of work to be done. So America or Europe, please step up and do more.
You're good on that. My question, and I had posed this to the panel earlier, was, can the U.S., as we're trying to implement Title III, as that sort of sits with the SEC and rulemaking sitting there, are there things that we can learn from other countries that have implemented, that are maybe a little further along the road in equity crowdfunding, or are we really out there in front of the pack and there's just nothing,
we can't take back? I think we're behind. I mean, the answer is yes, sort of, but it's going to be an imperfect analogy. Certainly, in discussions that we've had at the SEC, we will reference ASOP, we'll reference the Australian market, we'll reference from a debt perspective the UK. I mean, there's certainly things that there's data out there. Again, it's simply not, it's not a direct analogy, but it's not nothing. It's worth it, and we have referenced it. And I think that to some extent it's been helpful. But at the end of the day, it has to come out here. It has to come out right. If it comes out wrong, it might as well, I don't want to say it might not come out at all. But it may end up being, without getting too much in the weeds, one of the things that Devin mentioned, it may end up being very helpful up to 100,000, moderately helpful to $500,000, and then maybe not all that helpful between the 500,000 and the cap of $1 million because of the differences. We may end up where it really may move the needle for smaller enterprises that are perhaps debt-based, for which there's not an obvious exit, somebody that's like a dry cleaner or a pizzeria or something like that. Obviously, that's not something that's going to have, I don't know what an exit looks like on a dry cleaner, but I do know that they can take on some debt and they can service it, and that could be helpful. And they could have 2 dry cleaners or 4 or whatever. Gino's Pizza in downtown Detroit wants to move and set up a second one in the suburbs where their clientele is, and they raise $250,000 to buy ovens and scale lease. Going to be useful for that. Now, whether or not it actually helps at the larger, the bright, shiny tech, where you're looking at multiples or hopeful multiples of 5, 10x, I don't know. But I'd like to find out. And the only way to find out is if the SEC gets the rules out.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
And any specific, and I know this is more American focused, but any specific recommendations for Title III?
Changes recommendations?
What if you were in charge of the rule writing for?
So a lot of the things have already been done conveniently in that both the predecessor bill to Title III of the Jobs Act and the most recent thing that was called Jobs Act 2.0, Congressman Henry's bill, have a lot of those. Recommendation 1, raise the caps. It really is a game changer to be raising $3 to $5 million, not $500,000 to $1 million. You're changing entirely the scope of what kind of platforms can do it, how much capital can be spent on creating the infrastructure if you raise it. Changing the liability profile of those portals, whether it's by not imputing them the liability of the issuers or by changing the regulatory burdens upon them and lowering them, and we've written a very detailed letter on how that can be done. And those I think are the essential. Oh, and the restructuring. Right now, some things that normally structure in like a multi-LLC structure, like a real estate portfolio, would be forbidden under Title III.
Your SPV.
Yeah, the SPV structure, you can't have a multi-SPV structure. It would be permitted under Title III.
You know, because sorry.
So he's very concerned about this, and if you read DJ's testimony to the U.S. Congress on that subject, you can find more details there. So I think those are some early changes. We wrote more than a dozen letters to the SEC with very specific changes, kind of grouped by area, and I think that there are a lot, but those I think are the first three that really need to be changed before rules come out, which they should do soon.
Devin, any additional thoughts to that?
No, I think these guys, yeah, I think they hit on things. I think what they have said, I would reiterate, fundamentally, they've got to issue rules so we can start practice. Because until they start seeing outcomes, we can't really know how to fix and make it work or how bad it may be. We've got to have an issue.
The final one that we didn't reiterate there that Devin mentioned though was changing the audit thresholds, which in part is statutory, but is also regulatory. They took what many people expected to be the one-time audit or the one-time reviewed financials, and they made it an annual requirement in the regulations by mandate. We've recommended to them that they at least roll it back to the crowdfund investors can call for one of those upon request, but in most cases, the investors won't want to call for an audit. Unless
as I said, if the cost outweighs the benefit, and the investor determine that, okay, you know what, the 5,000, whatever it costs, we'd rather you put it into the company, off you go, as opposed to being required.
And I think that there's also an opportunity for portals to define themselves new unique selling points towards investors. So, for example, providing monitoring systems which integrate directly with bookkeeping practices. I mean, it's one thing of setting the rules, it's another thing of implementing them, and I truly believe that that's where the crowdfunding industry is heading to. It's basically a financial big data play, and the players that are currently developing those software are probably the ones that will survive. We listed our company last year in the US, so we got a lot of questions, for example, on our Super 8K, not really on the structuring of the company itself, but more on the crowdfunding process. So there is a profound interest in what is happening abroad. Obviously, that needs to be adjusted towards more towards the American standards. But yet again, there is software out there that can do this, and this will only get spread. So
I want to open it up because we're running out of time here. You guys have a lot to say. I can take a couple questions. Yes?
One of the qualities of an open competitive market is that buyers and sellers, there's more opportunity for buyers. Sellers compete for buyers. And the way crowdfunding tends to be couched to ways for the sellers, the companies, to find more buyers. Can you envision a setting where crowdfunding results in companies competing for investors by offering lower valuations, better terms? And in particular, what's your thoughts about an SEC requirement to require issuers to disclose prominently what their valuation is and maybe discuss how they came about it?
It's in the law. You have to disclose the valuation.
No, you don't.
Is that true?
Well, you look at any offering document right now?
No, right. What's coming in Title III?
I think it should be for S1s too. If you want a competitive capital market.
Why would you do it as a requirement to going with your initial statement about it being a competitive marketplace? why would you make it a requirement? The market will simply require that. If there's, money is, if companies are competing for investment dollars, then the ones that are more fully, the companies, the issuers that are more fully disclosed will be more readily able to garner those investment dollars. Why make it a requirement? It's going to be something that if you don't do it, no one's going to invest in your company. No, or am I misunderstanding?
I think there's an investor literacy issue.
Oh, there's no doubt that there's an investment.
And one way to improve the literacy is to make the key information available. So you really get the benefits. For example, in many supermarkets, you'll see unit pricing, price per ounce, price per pound, whatever. And yes, anybody can go and use a calculator to calculate that, but it wasn't until some states required grocers to post that it really had the benefit of making consumers better shoppers, but it also had the benefit of taking producers of goods and having them compete on something other than brand name or packaging.
I don't want to keep occupying this, but I would say that what you hit upon is what we try to get back to. Go back to the Securities Act of 33 and 34. It's all about that. It's not so much about protecting investors from themselves, or at least that wasn't the notion then. It's evolved into something else. It was about what you're saying, which is disclosure, which is to say you must have information in order to make a decision. You can't make an informed decision if you don't have information. So I support that, although I don't know how to do it entirely.
Woody made a good point too, that Title III requires disclosure. It doesn't require disclosure necessarily of the price. It's even the price for the process, right, Woody? And I'm a big fan of, although I don't think many platforms will do it this way. We had the discussion this morning about Prosper moving from an auction-based model to a sort of an underwritten model. I really like the auction approach. I think that's awesome. I hope we'll end up there with some platform. I don't think we will with many, but I really like the auction process. That's essentially what's going on with an S1. It's an auction. That's why it's not in an S1, as I understand it, right? I'm moving with the attorneys around here, but there's not a valuation discussion in the S1 because the valuation is set at the very last minute in the offering.
But at that point, it's a pricing dialogue, not a valuation dialogue, but yes.
Yeah. So, but that's the process. I'm not sure it's disclosed in the S1, but it's understood in the marketplace, at least somewhat. And I think the CrowdFunding Act, Title III, says you can either disclose the price or the process.
All right, we have time, I think, for one more question.
Yeah, it's more a comment, and we just when Richard asked in the beginning, what the paradigm shift. In addition to everything changed, one more change. What I say is actually when the statement of that data is a barrier is more and more an inaccurate statement because data is there, but analytics is not there. And for the type of data that the investors need, or for the entrepreneur need, or the government to make regulators they need different data. And we actually are oversupply of many data. But actually, when we look at from the analytics, how when they want to each actor want to make a decision, some of the analytics which are behind. And so if, for example, in the not only about availability of the data, but also starting to just work as a consortium or some sort of data for different type of actors, these are the analytics which can provide for you. And the reason for me to say that is, for example, in China, what happened in for P2P lending, that the government was expecting to have the new law in the middle of this year, but it was postponed to by the end of the year, maybe postponed again. And as what many of you said, that the governments are very open to engage with the platform for the regulation. However, that they need to learn, and they have to learn, and but if from the different community starting to just provide that analytics, then when they just when I read all the analytic data that's signed by different platform, all the industrial report in China, and this 50 billion forecast was signed in almost all. The reason it's not it's an analytic because they can use this is at the first level. But when it's to go to the second level, they want to really make the regulation work to balance the enabling environment plus the investor protection. Then those kind of the second level of analytic is really critical, which actually that is really the part which is in a lack.
Right. Did anybody on the panel want a last word? You would have like parting comment they're dying to make, but I didn't give them an opportunity to say.
Thank you all so much. It's a great day and a half. And hopefully we'll see you again. And I thank Richard for all of his hard work. Paul and Danielle, Troy, and Cynthia, the whole fun staff.
So I am going to make a wild prediction that we'll see a bigger conference next year. And next year, I'm hoping to see more economists, more information scientists, public policy people. I mean, this topic is cross-cutting so many disciplines and so many issues. So given we have Federal Reserve and some government folks here and people talk to the SEC, I think the government does need to fund a large data collection effort, whether that's done through an NDR, whether that's done here or somewhere. But I have been struggling for 2 years to get platforms to provide data, and it is a very significant and difficult challenge. So I think without some mandate from the government, it's probably going to be a lot of little bites of apples the last couple of years. There'll be some bigger chunks taken out. Oh, you're government, yes, hi. Yeah, come on.
I just wanted to, I'm sorry to interrupt your closing remark, but just to let people know, there's an obscure government tool called the Paperwork Reduction Act that opens up the information collection process for public comment. Their rulemaking, like the Jobs Act Title III rulemaking, surely would have an information collection associated with it. Any member of the public can comment about data fields that they feel are relevant. It goes through O&B review, and it is already included in your taxpayer budget.
All right. So this is the end of the formal conference. Feel free to stick around. There's a nice coffee shop downstairs. The faculty club is over here, and they do have more liquid beverages if you want to purchase them. And it's been our honor always to see you, and hope to see you next year. Thank you all.
Yeah.
There, you understand?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, maybe we should be there.
We're live. Thanks for we were here to say, so live in this great conference. Put it in Berkeley and School of Finance. This is the second year that this is one of my favorite conferences because I get to hang around with very academic environment, hang around with all these smart people. So you're fun of them. I enjoy it very much and you guys do a great job of hospitality and everything over there. Get involved with all the academic report, all this data. Speaking of that, how funding your organization is actually your company, how capital crowdfunding has gone. Company, the company, like, the teaching role and how you do that is usually one of the people ask, what do you have to actually do? What do you do after professional? Make sure that you are checking why services, the regulatory That's good. how to get the market of the
Yeah, that's help them.
That one of the and the crowdfunding law and law act here in the US.
Start CEOs. So I think that I believe that
Right. Thanks very much. Everybody understand it? DJ, yeah, you join me in this.
Yes.
Thanks, guys. We're gonna have a couple of panelists here, actually, they're here, and DJ called me. Tell us, too many last podcast. You really have to get this academic. What do you think?
Speaking of data,
Alright, I suggest that I'm going to make sure that I'm here. Tell us about So why is this about this? What's going larger scale.
But, you know, yeah, portion of yes, they have to be accredited. I would say that they don't invest usually 2025, but our average investment is certainly in excess of 100,000. We have a lot of people that are invested in
I actually own one of the, I saw that really money and all this. I haven't gotten off on
yeah, I think that we're going to see eventually it could be as early as next week, but I think that barring something unusual, you really should see them no later than first quarter next year. So it's in the offing, right? You know, after 2.5 years since its passage, so 3 years since the anniversary of the first iteration was passed on the House floor in October 2011. So we're almost there. So everybody can just not patient and hang on. Yes, I think that hard to say, but if I had to make a prediction on the spot, I would think that there's going to be initially a liberation of platforms oriented, and then there'll be consolidation. Actually, then there'll be failures. So already starting, and then and then there'll be some consolidation. That's many years. It's going to be a fun time.
We gotta bring you back. I think I have a final word about the conference, about the industry, about in your life. I also give a lot of credibility to our industry as well. I think that had people like Richard Schwartz, Yeah, okay. Well, you know, I should say thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having you guys in your really live here. Appreciate it. Come back and share better news with the job.
I think certainly by this time next year.
All right, thanks very much, guys. All right, thanks.
Next, I would,
That would be, yeah, I'll be here. Stop by next week. Where is it?
Where is Richard?
Yeah, you know, actually, later, yeah. And I love this. Fine.
All right.